and learned from, and in the world of supporting us all, architectural history, theology, and those good things. So, but I wanted to have a real conversation with them. I'll kick it off first with several of the questions you all have given me, and then we'll just open it up to general questions. If you want to keep bringing questions up, it's fine. We can do that too, but we'll also open it up in a little while to everybody, to questions just taken directly. So the first question would be to Mr. Stroik and Mr. McNamara. I'm just reading these straight off here. The question is fairly direct. What does a church look like?
Well, that was the point of the talk. The church looks like the world redeemed and united to God. What does that mean architecturally? Every age has decided how they best understood how to reveal it. But fundamentally, the architecture has to be ordered. This is why certain theories of architecture that are embodying chaos are anti-incarnational. It's the restoration of order to chaos, not the bringing of chaos to order. But that doesn't mean, oh, I don't like Frank Gehry. It means what Frank Gehry has chosen to do is not really a good match with church architecture. So ordered, radiant, theocentric, and redeemed.
Duncan, any thoughts?
No, I think the great beauty of the Western tradition is that there are many ways that a church has looked, and we will see with great originality some other ways that it can look. And there are things that one could show Americans or children that are foreign to them, but are recognizably sacred.
Use the microphone.
Really?
Use
Oh,
the microphone.
I hate microphones. They're the death of preaching. Right? Father Giles? Yeah. Thank you for the Dominicans. No, just short and sweet. But it's interesting, there are buildings, just like if you ask children, you know, the famous story, you ask little children to draw a house all over the world, to draw a house and door in the middle and a chimney. And they don't live in a house that looks like that, but that's, you know, a house. And but one can also do the opposite and show great churches like an Eastern Orthodox church or a wood church from Finland or a South American church to a child in America, and they know it's a sacred building, probably a church. So
Keep going. This is to all of you. Liturgical life is more than symbolic of the heavenly Jerusalem. It is memory. Christ said, "Do this in memory of me." Memory was very important to the Jews, obviously. How does memory play a role in contemporary church design, particularly in its details, and is that memory only sacred or also mundane?
Well, I'll just offer a simple observation, and those who are more learned in these areas can say something more profound. But I think, actually back to the first question as well, I think that a church should be a place that, a cathedral especially, or a church, a chapel, should be a place that somehow inspires us and somehow reaches toward a point that separates itself from the secular world. And I think if there's not a sense of coming to a place that has a sacred importance, that isn't somehow a place apart, that somehow separates itself from the secular world and is fundamentally about our relationship with God, then I don't think I think it's going to fail as a place that has long-term meaning, as a sacred place. It doesn't have to be simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be somehow profound. And I think it has, for me personally, has very little to do with perhaps coming to this question of memory and expression within. Very little to do with lux and with streets of gold and with high materials. To me, a place that has real meaning as a spiritual place is a place that has a sense of authenticity, that has a place of almost modest humility in the face of God. And I think that, to me, that's a very, very important quality in a place that's sacred. And that's why, for me, I know this is a trite thing, and many people here would argue this, but coming into a place of nature that is like, say, Muir Woods in California, the Sequoia stand, has a place of spiritual ennobling, I guess you might say, that is so profound that I think that's as strong as any of the great places made of marble and stained glass.
So if I may jump in just to react to that a little bit, respond to it, is the cathedral in a way a sacred grove? Is that some of the idea behind it?
Are you talking about the one in Oakland?
In Oakland, yeah.
Well, maybe. I mean, the building in Oakland is meant to be somehow bringing together our memory of the natural world and the urbanized world and contemporary culture. And so it's meant to be somehow a bringing together of the most ancient of our memories in terms of place of sanctuary and our relationship with the natural world to our present condition.
And if I might add to that, at the fall, humanity fell, but nature fell. And so there's a Thoreauian notion of nature. I'm going to go back to the Walton Pond and walk around the woods, and somehow I'll be restored. Well, lions still eat the lambs, and mosquitoes still bite us, and snakes still are poisonous, right? So here we have this issue. Nature has become hostile to us, and we become hostile to each other. Now, in grace, we start to grow beyond our animalistic tendencies, but what a church in the great tradition, particularly very strong in the Eastern tradition, shows you not nature as it is, but in fact it blocks out the genuine, real trees of the forest and shows you nature redeemed, which is why you don't have big clear glass windows in churches traditionally. But you've gone inside, you see palm trees in mosaic and angels and saints coexisting, so that you have a vision of the world redeemed, not only experiencing what's good in creation still after the fall, but what the world will be like when it's completely restored. And I think that's the sacramental nature of a church. And if you throw that away, then all you have is the good of creation, which is good, but you're supposed to see more than that.
That's really nice, and it's a nice question. What it brings to my mind, do this in memory of me, is the memory of things, and you can say memory of buildings, and of course that's very much what I was trying to say, is that architects actually, saints look at saints to model their lives after, and Catholics should too, and architects should model their buildings after other buildings, and we do, whether we admit it or not. But the idea of do this in memory of me, there are so many things that can connect us to the room of the Last Supper, to the room of Pentecost, to other great places from the Old Testament, the mountains, the temple, and since then. So, and that's very rich, and in a certain way, kind of, I think this comports with what Dennis was saying, is that the church building should reflect these many ideas. It's hard architecturally, iconographically, to, every single one of them you can point to something, but in a sense they should remember the great moments of the Eucharist, the man in the desert, for instance.
And I'd like to answer a little bit of the memory question, if I may. In the Jewish tradition, there was a concept of anamnesis, which is not just remembering, like, oh yes, once I did this. It is making real and present that which is remembered. So when Christ says, do this in memory of me, it doesn't just mean, oh, I remember this thing that happened a long time ago. What does the youngest child say at Passover? Why is this night different from every other night? It doesn't say, why is this night 2,000 years ago different from every other night that's happened since then? So that which is remembered is made real, and that's the insertion of the temporal into the eternal. So you remember the saints, not just because they're a good role model, although they are, but because they become real and present in the liturgical reality again. And if you don't have them to encounter iconically, then you don't perceive them. And then you participate in a less full way. And Vatican II asks for full, conscious, and active participation. We don't want to deny that to people under the guise of being true to the age, or some perception of what the age is defined by. The age of faith is still today, as it was every other time in the last 2,000 years.
Okay. A couple sets of longer questions, and then we'll turn it over to everybody. One paired question. I think a little bit more to you guys. One more to you. Not to split things up too much here. Thank you. More questions. Here we go. First, if you have to take one ancient style, for which reasons do you consider one and not the other? And, as a paired question again, what is the importance of technology? Because when Michelangelo built St. Peter's, he conceived the church in a classical way, but the new assumptions in the fields of engineering drove him to the big dome and a whole new kind of architecture. What about technologies today? How does that drive architecture? Actually, to all of you.
Well, I don't pick a style over another style. Style is a set of facts. It was existed from this time to this time. It's got this many pointed arches, this many rounded arches. It's made of this. It comes from this place. That's interesting, but if you take it back in the so what Socratic method, well, it's pointed arches, so what? Well, they're stronger. Okay, so what? Well, holds up the taller church. So what? Well, the taller church is seen from a greater distance. So what? Well, people can see it from a distance and come to meet God. So what? They can become divinized. So what? They can be happy with God forever. Right? That's the thought process that has to happen. And it's not because of the pointed arch. The pointed arch helped that process. Is the architecture an articulate bearer of heavenly realities that will form us to be heavenly? That is the question. Now, that's understood intellectually in conventional sign. So conventional signs are not ordained by God, but they're things that society understands. We're all speaking English. Conventionally, we understand English. And you hear those urban legends about these, children raised in a trailer in Appalachia where their mother taught them to speak Klingon, from Star Trek. And the social workers go and they don't know what the kids are saying. That's a failure of conventional sign, right? So you can have conventional sign. It's not a failure to speak English today as we did 100 years ago. It's how we communicate. So church should have conventional sign as well. And whatever style does that well, in an elevated, poetic, and festive way, right? Not a functional engineer's aesthetic, but a poet's aesthetic, and that's different. That's the big difference. Technology was the handmaiden of beauty and clarity in Michelangelo's day. Technology became the goal, the technological engineer's aesthetic that Le Corbusier asked for, and that's not the job of a church. The job of a church is not to have an engineer's aesthetic, it's to have God's aesthetic, a poetic, theological, and revelatory aesthetic.
Well, I don't only maybe reiterate a bit of what I said in my talk just moments ago, that in my observation at least, I think probably everyone would agree that the history of the Catholic Church in its architecture has been also a history of search for the most powerful technologies that will help to realize an end. And the end, I would submit, has been to create space, not objects, but space that one can enter that is a place apart, that is a place that somehow inspires, ennobles, and has a sense of poetry. And I think we think of technology as like iPods, I suppose, but technology really is simply a way of achieving an end, and it can be a technology in terms of an object, it can be a system, it can even almost be a way of thinking. So I think the Catholic Church has always been about this, about finding ways, the best of any generation, the best artistic sensibilities, the best use of technologies to the end of creating sacred space. So it's absolutely been part of the church throughout history. And anyway, so that's, I guess, my short answer.
The question specifically about technology and the cathedral in Oakland. This is a bit of a challenge to the use of wood and glass, so it'd be good to have a conversation about this. Wood breaks down in heat, and light can burn. As such, is deemed less noble than, say, bronze, stone, or even brick. So why use it for a 300-year-old building? Also, glass thermally is a poor performer. Nowadays, it's generally held together with rubber or silicone, which is often true, which also deteriorate quickly. So you see the nature of the question. Why use materials that it seems will fall apart?
Yeah. Why use materials that will fall apart? Very good point. Extremely good point. And a point that was raised many times by our building committee. Because this is a building that was, there were two basic edicts. It was really kind of interesting that I was given in the beginning of that project. The first was you must meet the budget. Second is that, second is that, well, there have been some examples where this has not been, as you know, Duncan, the case over time. And the other was that this building must be here for 300 years. So, that's an easy guarantee, because I guarantee I won't be here for 300 years, so, nor do I think anyone in the building committee will be. So, yeah, we'll say it'll be here for 300 years. Actually, to me, the real question embedded in that was really not how you technically make something stand for 300 years, but how you make something worthy of standing for 300 years. And that, for me, was actually the most profound challenge. But coming to the question of technology in these 2 points, very good points. First is, yes, without question, wood can degenerate over the years, over the centuries. There are certainly examples in China of temples, as well as in Japan of temples, in which wood has been used not just on the inside, but actually on the exterior of buildings. This requires maintenance, of course. It requires painting every so often, but for not decades, but centuries. And they're still with us. Millennium, thank you. So, on the more pragmatic side, I would say that that the same company that making these are actually pieces of wood for the big ribs in the Oakland Cathedral that are actually glue laminated. All the architects know what that is, but it's basically just taking long piece of wood and using adhesive to put them together. Long history for this. And they're using these actually for bridges in Alaska, just exposed. So, these are meant to be around. The other, just a sort of minor thing about the wood is that it actually, in terms of a safety factor, is actually better than steel, because the wood we've used is all called heavy timber, and that's basically a size of material at least 4 by 6 inches, which, when subjected to flame and to fire, will burn to a certain extent, then it chars. It will then retain its structural integrity, unlike steel, which will, of course, melt and collapse. So, there are ways, of course, of fireproofing steel, but nevertheless, that's just a basic point. So, the wood is will have a long longevity, at least 300 years. We have, mainly because of the size of it. Secondly, we have treated the glass with an ultraviolet film, which is transparent, which screens out 99% of the ultraviolet rays coming into the space. So that ultraviolet, of course, is the primary element that degrades wood structurally. So we're very, very confident of this, and we've done a lot of studies on it. As far as the glass itself and the way it's held together, another good point. I actually originally wanted to just have this glass literally held together by glue. I wanted to use a silicone, so you'd see none of these annoying mullions outside of the building, and at least not the horizontal ones. And the construction manager just said, well, look, this building has to be 300-year buildings, therefore we have to use mechanical fasteners, which we've done. There will have to be reglazed at some point in the next 100 or 150 years. But as far as the temperature is concerned, we've actually designed it, we don't even care how hot it gets in the upper reaches of this building. As a matter of fact, the glass, believe it or not, is not even insulating glass. Now, everybody's house has insulating glass in it. This is simply laminated glass. The reason for this is that the building's designed to be completely passively, I mean, we can actually have mechanical ways of doing this too, but completely passively cooled. Oakland is a place that gets very cold in the evening and very hot during the day, a diurnal swing. So we allow the building and the concrete to get cool in the evening. We have openings with little grills on them under the pews that allow air to come through. We have a double slab. Air comes through, and cool air basically comes up, and we use what we call displacement cooling. Cool air is heavier than warm air, and therefore we're only cooling the lower 12 to 15 feet in which people are occupying the building. The rest of the building can get as hot. We think sometimes we've actually had, we believe it'll get as hot as 140 degrees at the very top of the building. And we have vents that open up to allow this hot air to escape. And that in itself also helps to physically pull cool air up through these openings. There are times in summertime, we haven't had to do this yet, but there are times in summertime when if it gets hot enough, we can actually turn on chillers and actually force cool air through those openings to cool that lower 12 feet. Finally, in the wintertime, we use the old Roman technique of hot water circulating in the concrete slab to warm your feet, and that's enough to keep you very comfortable. So the idea is to make a building that is extremely, extremely gentle both in terms of the way we construct it, in terms of the environment, but also for the next 300 years, that will be very, very minimal in its use of energy to make it usable and maintainable. One last comment, sorry, I got me in a roll here. One last thing about this pragmatics of the building. I wanted to have no lights at all above the 15-foot high reliquary wall. Almost all the lighting comes from concealed lights you don't see around the top of that 15-foot high reliquary wall, which shoots lights across the two sides to illuminate the wooden vaults. I did in the end have to acquiesce to having some theatrical lights just around the edge of the oculus ceiling for Christmas pageants and other kind of theatrical events. But the idea is to make a building that is absolutely minimal in its maintenance over time, that can be done very, very simply, easily, and where we're not using financial resources to maintain the building, but rather to maintain the activities within it.
I do have some more questions, so let's open it up now and take questions from you guys. John?
I wanted to ask Mr. Hartman like a bishop that came up,
Sorry, a collaboration with what again?
well, with someone like a bishop. Well,
Yeah, bishop.
In this case, you had to deal with a very particular person, a very particular bishop. But you mentioned having if you will compromise on your design because of his nervousness. But in this work, with such a big project that has such stature, were you helped? You mentioned the assistance of people in your firm, a great body of people. Was it a help to you in this process to engage with people like the bishop? And if so, how? And then secondly, how has this changed your understanding of your relationship to the one for whom this thing ultimately is built?
Well, first the question of collaboration. Anyone who's an architect knows that collaboration, if you're going to make anything that has is kind of worthy in the end, it's not like art where you can be a solo act. It's about collaboration. I was extremely fortunate with the individuals with whom I worked at this cathedral, beginning at the bishop, through the building committee, the sacred art and liturgy committee. These were people who were extremely supportive and encouraging, and there were issues. It was always about budget, definitely, but there were some issues in the beginning. Of course, people were unsure. Despite what was seen today and my own efforts to make this a place that was as much about antiquity as it was about our current place, about this idea of memory that Duncan and Dennis have very effectively pointed out, there were some real questions by many in the community about this modern structure, and shouldn't it look like a mission style? There were sort of hate drawings on the internet about, directed toward me personally about this should be a mission style building, and what's the matter with this person? And in the end, that's all gone away happily. But the bishop was absolutely fundamental. He was courageous, he was supportive, and he was wise. And I think it's important. I mean, it's a gift to have a client who has wisdom. And I saw that through his leadership, it permeated the rest of the group. And I'll just say one other quick thing on that point, that Bishop Vigneron, this project started with a man named Bishop John Cummins. Both these people become really good friends of mine, and they, through the process. And Cummins was a real man of the people, very gregarious, but he retired just as this was starting. And Vigneron came in from outside, and there were rumors this person would be very conservative, maybe doesn't want a cathedral at all. And he arrived and didn't immediately jump on the bandwagon, but he asked me to review the design with him and discuss it with him, the intent. And he came then shortly thereafter and said, I really think this is the thing that we should be doing. It's absolutely correct. And he was an incredible supporter and incredibly wise in his advice going through. Not only wise in terms of the metaphors within the building, but also how you get it done. As far as my relationship, my personal relationship and spirituality, you can't help but do something like this and not be affected by it. And Cathedral, of course, is a place that all the great events of life are remarked upon, happen, or are marked in a place like this. So death, birth, marriage, all the joys and all the tragedy that comes with life are marked in a place like this. So to have the opportunity to do something like this and to be so profoundly engaged with it, and to be in a position of thinking about this on a daily basis for the 6 or 7 years that was the process of design getting this building built. Of course, I think with any sensate individual would have to have a major effect, and for me it certainly has. And it's affected in many ways, but it certainly reinforced thinking I've had about my architecture, at least going forward, which I think has been positive.
Absolutely, but just 1 second. I want to throw in a question just of my own. I'm fascinated by two sides of something that I want to see come together somehow, and I don't know how. So maybe you all can help me. I love the 4th to 9th century, as many people here know, the 4th to 9th century Byzantine-inspired Christian churches of Rome, where there's this incredible iconography that transforms over time, but it's fairly clear, of Christ descending in the clouds of glory, to the earth restored, to renewed in paradise. It has the palm tree and everybody, and it has us greeting him in return. And it's what I would love to do is go build a church where I could make one of those somehow in our own time. I also walk through the architecture building here and see the most fantastic patterns of light and material made on the computer machines, the CDC machine and other machines, and the 3D printers made. And I look at that and I go, that is, if I had energy to burn on making something beautiful right now, I would go do that. So, and there's a tiny place where I can see they meet. One of my favorite churches doesn't even have that iconography I mentioned. It's Santa Sabina. You know, we don't have so much left of what that iconography was, but we have the kind of ancient grill work in the windows above, which are these patterns of light. And you think, well, maybe that's where, but that's not rich enough. So what do you all think? How, you know, this image, even devotional imagery, which is maybe very concrete and is so important, and yet the beautiful things we're making today, we want people who are making the most beautiful things they can think of to make today, we want them to make them for the church. So how would each of you think we bring these together?
Well, I would just like to say that the great thing about this conference is that there are, amongst us and amongst the group, there are different ways to solve these problems, and that's what's so exciting. I'll now just speak personally that I'm passionate about the hand, the human hand, human craftsmanship, the thing that gets me, I mean, we use lots of modern technology in building our buildings, whether it's cutting the stone or the marble, and the machine does it, and it saves money, and it's fast and all that. But I'll tell you, the thing that really gets me excited is a sculptor sculpting something out of marble or out of clay that turns into bronze, or the people cutting the stone bas-relief that's going to be put in the building. To me, that's what really makes great architecture. And in fact, I always find, as much as I joked the other day about how architecture is, we know the primary art, the reality is that people are actually moved by the mosaics, the stained glass, the things, I think the things made by hand. And as humans endowed by the Creator to create also, that's personally what I think we should be doing. And we're in a situation where we are so concerned about the economy and putting people to work. I'd love to see more handcrafts, find excuses to put people to work with handcrafts, and it'd be a win-win.
I think we just have to keep calling ourselves back to the ontology question. Ontologically, what is a church? It's not a factory, it's not a house. Right? There are certain denominational breakdowns that say a church is a house because that's where the apostles went, described in the Acts of the Apostle. And so you have an ontology of house, and you can make a beautiful house church. In the Catholic tradition, that is not a full understanding of the ontology of the church. And so the question is, what is it? It's this image of our life redeemed. There's a million ways to say that. There's a million ways to make a poem about that. There's a million ways to sing that song in French, German, Chinese, Greek, whatever it is. But the content has to be the same because it's a revelation of a thing that pre-exists us. So if you can do it with a computer in a way that is full, complete, radiant, glorious, attractive, and does justice to corresponding proportionally to what the heavenly Jerusalem looks like, then by all means, do it. If you're more interested in the novelty of mechanization than you are in the revelation of the heavenly realities, then the emphasis is in the wrong place.
Please.
So among the things that really impress me and I think are beautiful about the Catholic faith is this idea that, this idea that we should be preparing the world for Christ's return. Now that's a very, very pretty strong, kind of edict for an architect, that, you should be preparing, what you do should actually be in preparation for the return of Christ. So if you're Christian and believe in this, then this is a very, very strong and very, very positive thing. I mean, think about that. So, I don't know, I think maybe Duncan or Dennis mentioned, did you mention the word beauty today?
The B word.
The B word, which is interesting. Beauty has been anathema to modernists, but it's especially in art. But it's a fact. Beauty is an important thing in our world, and I think that, again, this idea that the church embraces the idea of beauty. Just say it, beauty. I mean, that's a very, very powerful thing. So, how you get there is a kind of an open question. I think the way that we get there will continue to evolve with time. And I totally agree with the point about the connection to our humanity, and whether that's actually by physically making it yourself or by conceptualizing it and having a tool that does it for you, but does it in a way that has this connection is really important. And there are many things that go into this, but scale, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I think that there's, personally, we have just great promise going ahead. And it's just about having architects who really fundamentally engage in churches in thinking about what sacred space really can be, and using the best of their intellect, the best tools. I think we'll have a great future in this area.
And I think one of the questions we're wrestling with is we're wrestling with the heritage of the Enlightenment. You know, the move from the object to the subject. Is the beauty in the object? Does it have the characteristics of its ontology? St. Thomas Aquinas said that a beautiful thing is that which reveals most clearly its ontological reality. If it doesn't reveal it very well, then we have to do all this mental work of saying, what is that? The sign says church, but it doesn't look like a church. And you know what people do. They give nicknames to churches that don't look like churches. So Our Lady of Maytag, Our Lady of the Airport Hangar, all that stuff. Now that's flip and it's mean and it's all that. But it's because they have a disjunct in the mind between the ontological reality that the church should have and what they see. And our failure to understand easily is a result of the fall, right? Our mind is clouded, intellect is clouded. When a thing is beautiful, it relieves us from the effects of the fall by allowing us to perceive beauty, ontology in the mind of God easily. And that is something we delight in because it's like being relieved from hunger or whatever it happens to be. You feel more like your intended glorious reality. The Enlightenment turned it all to the subject. Beauty is whatever makes me feel good, as opposed to beauty is the thing outside of me, which is an aesthetic experience that shapes me into what I should be, rather than what I think that thing means. And that's a very different way of viewing the world. The Catholic Church does not take the Enlightenment view in its entirety, and that, I think, is a central question for a lot of the things we're talking about.
I had two hands already up, Milton's and then James, so no.
Yes, I want to pick back up on what Duncan was saying. He acted like it was a personal preference to see sign of handwork in the space. And I think it's more than that. To me, that space in Oakland reminds me of the abolition of man, in that there's no sign of man having worked in there. I mean, there was a pointing to some stack of lumpers that it looked like, and say, well, here's a sign of the handcraft. But machines cut boards. That's not handcraft. The only thing worked were things that were not really part of the fabric of the building, some old statues and things. And I think it's sad that the only art part of the fabric really was just some sort of projection of this metal screen, and it's a borrowing. It's an overscale billboard style borrowing. Andy Warhol kind of style borrowing of a glorious masterpiece from West Warwickshire Cathedral. It is such a denial of our own culture. It is so cowardly that we can't think that we can decorate our own buildings, especially a cathedral, that we have to borrow a crummy image of a great masterpiece from our distant past. I mean, it's an abdication of our responsibility as architects to be the mother, for architects to be the mother of the arts. And I think that building just did not address that whole point, which has traditionally been.
I didn't design it. If you'd like to address the comments directly, you can speak to Craig, and I'd love for you to respond if you wish. But you don't always.
Everyone, we all have.
I mean, I actually love the buildings, just to be clear about it. But I don't. But I want to address to him.
I really can't address the point because it's a very strongly held personal view. And that's the thing also, I think, about sacred space. It is very, very much about incredibly strongly held personal views about what these spaces can be. So I take your comments, but stand by what we did.
James, I think you had your hand up next.
I have a question for both architects.
Not the historian? Come on. He's good. He's an architect too, I think. Oh, come on.
But I would like to ask you both to talk briefly about your individual architect's relationship to the work that both precedes your project or your practice, and the work that you also imagine will follow. So that, for example,
With pleasure.
Craig was ready to go.
Oh, you told me.
All right, all right, all right. Actually, I'm the one inspired by Ife Jones. Come on. No, I'll just tell a little story, which is we had the wonderful opportunity to be commissioned to do a college chapel in California. It's a little smaller than Oakland Cathedral and a little less expensive, unfortunately. But what was interesting about it was the client wanted a cruciform church that had a dome, that had a tower, that had columns and arches. That sounds really traditional, right? Columns and arches, a dome, cruciform. Okay, tell me all the great examples. You're thinking of lots of Renaissance examples that are cruciform with a dome, but the columns and arches is actually very unique. And they asked me to do things that they thought was like arch traditional, like the most basic, like what everybody would want. Again, it gets back to my point about, you know, all these ideas that are seen as traditional, but so actually it's been done very little. Brunelleschi, of course, did it. But then you know what? The rest of the Renaissance said, and they went on to a different direction. They kind of went on the Albertine direction. I mean, he took a basilica plan, made a crucifix, and then put a dome over it? That's wacky. That's really wacky. Or it's really brilliant. It's innovative. So Brunelleschi did it, then it got cut off. Really, you don't see it continuing. The great Brunelleschi doesn't continue, right, in that way. So they wanted me to do that. Then you see it reappear, actually, the French neoclassicists, because they're taking the classical language and trying to be both constructionally innovative and, you know, make things lighter, and they really push this limit of this heavy dome coming down on columns and arches, right? That doesn't sound very tectonic. That's not the Pantheon. That's not the way you hold up a dome. So they did it, but in general, it's hardly ever been done. So it was kind of fun that the client wanted something super traditional, but they forced me to come up with something that was fairly, I would say, is pretty innovative. I mean, innovative in the U.S., innovative. I'm not saying it's never been done, but it's not typical. The other thing that was interesting about it was they wanted me to, in this one, it's a great book school, they wanted to embody all of the Western tradition in one building. They wanted it to be mission style. They wanted it to be Romanesque. They wanted it to be ancient. They wanted it to be Renaissance. They wanted it to be, they didn't know that they wanted it to be, you know, inspired by Bernini. And you can say it sounds pretty schizophrenic. Well, it would be, it could be. We worked hard though to make it one body and yet reflecting all this stuff. So again, kind of a very, because of the client, they pushed me to do what I considered a very hard task, but fairly innovative in a certain way. In the classical realm, it's fairly innovative. And so that was fun and a challenge. I don't know where it's going to go. I think it can only go upward, and my prediction is in the next 10 or 15 years, and this will prove whether we've really done a good job in the last 10 years, that we will see a classical or Gothic cathedral substantial like Oakland, like LA, with the amount of funds like Oakland or LA, that kind of money, which right now has only been being spent on modernist masterpieces and very impressive buildings. But I predict in the next 10 to 15 years we'll see a building in a traditional genre built with that kind of funding and with talented architect. Not me, but somebody else in this room probably.
So what inspired, what came before this inspirational? Well, for me, actually, this is a very interesting question, because when I thought about this building, it actually it opened up a whole array of memories and experiences, and also research. And beginning with the time as a college kid on a shoestring budget, hitchhiking through Europe, looking at Chartres and looking at Notre Dame and both Notre Dame in Paris as well as Notre Dame in Longchamp. And looking at both the great masterpieces of Borromini and Bernini and Michelangelo, of course, but also looking at the modern masters as well, and especially Corbusier, who's been apparently maligned here maybe for good reason in certain areas. But nevertheless, there is something very powerful about that little building in Longchamp, and you're right. There is definitely. I mean, I would actually be very humble to even mention this building and that one in the same sentence, but there certainly are qualities of light within that space that were that was on my mind in thinking about the way this building meets the ground in Oakland. certainly the unbelievable lightness of Sainte-Chapelle, and the way that, again, I would argue that the technology of that time make these unbelievably thin pieces of stone that allowed for this great luminosity of that glass. I mean, that was the technology at its absolute best at that time. And these things really impressed me. And in my own childhood, obviously, growing up in rural Indiana and the agrarian structures there, have a simplicity and a straightforwardness. All that, obviously is part of what influenced me and thought about this in my thinking about this building, especially. Also, certain other modern buildings that I showed the one in the Air Force Academy, but also Aero Saarinen has done too. I mean, we talk about, but it's not about big budgets. It's about having a sense of coming with a sense of humility and a sense of trying to extract out of, in Saarinen's case, a brick, some poetry. And if you look at the little MIT chapel, or look at also much less known but equally powerful is a tiny little round chapel he did at Drake University in Iowa, in Des Moines, Iowa. Just incredibly powerful but small works. And to me, all that certainly influenced me personally, and I think it has. I think for those who are seriously looking at sacred space, should be looking at these things carefully. As far as what my work may or may not influence in the future, I don't know, but I do hope that it will influence a sense of trying to find a cultural authenticity about how we're building this place in time, and how to be respectful of what's gone on in the past and still reflect an authenticity about our moment in time. And that's what I've tried to achieve. So I'll leave it at that.
Even though the question was addressed to me, can I throw something in here? I am very unsatisfied with the argument old equals good. And I'm very unsatisfied with the argument new equals bad, new equals good, old equals whatever it happens to be. The question is it revealing what it's supposed to reveal? So you say, okay, a column. Why would the Christians take the column from the temple of the pagan religions? Well, it's the technology of their time. That's what they were doing. That's their culture. That's true. Why would the Christians embrace it so heartily? And you start to realize, and if you've ever read George Hersey's little book, The Lost Meaning of Classical Architecture, which I think everybody should read, even if you don't agree with a word of it, he goes and finds, why is a capital called a capital? Why is a pedestal called a pedestal? Why is it a foot? Why is a capital a head? Why is a column a body? And if the building is made up of the mystical body, the members, the pillars of the church, that Galatians 2:9 says, Cephas, James, and John are pillars of the church, and the architecture is supposed to have a correspondence to the people of the ecclesia, and all of a sudden you have this inheritance of columns that are men and women and virgins and mothers, and you put Ionic in Santa Maria Maggiore because that's the column associated with the motherly woman, as Vitruvius tells you. The mythical fiction of inheritance, whether it's literal or not, is nonetheless one of the cultural markers. Why replace that with steel beams? Suddenly you lose all that inheritance. Just because you can doesn't mean you should reduce the specificity just to be true to your age. It's not about the logic of the engineer's aesthetic. It's about the power of architecture to reveal the invisible sacramental realities. And that breaks the barrier between old equals good and new equals good, and says theological revelation equals good. How can we do it the best way? Not as somehow spiritual, but as specific and pulsing with life. And there'll be different ways to do that. If you're a monastery and a Trappist monk, it's going to be much simpler. If you're somewhere else, it might be different, but there's still the same goal that you're supposed to keep in mind.
Travis?
I had another question, but I just want to respond. When I saw those Corinthian Greek, so my roots go back because it's Romans, and I just saw Zeus, Apollo, Athena. I did not see Christ in any of those columns. So I'd like to push you further and say that the steel beams, like on those, the little cross at that wonderful church in pure steel, stole my heart more than seeing Zeus holding up Jesus. Comment. But the question I'd love the three of you to play with is to maybe play with Sagrada Familia, because to me it bridges so many of the articles of the hand touch, this extraordinary use of the human intelligence that God gave us to soar, and all the things that I've seen in these pieces sort of come to play. And I just thought it would be fun to speak a third piece after that hasn't shown up.
That's really good. If I could start, I think Sagrada Familia and Antonio Gaudí is I would see him as the master who knows the language and who knows the tradition very well. Yeah, yeah. And you can see it in that building, of course. It is, like so many of the architects of the late 19th and early 20th century, it is a transformation of a Gothic cathedral, right? Using all kinds of means. So he's a man who understood a certain tradition. I mean, this is an early 20th century building we're talking about, right? This is an old building, 100 years old. And it's brilliant. This is the tradition with originality. And it's very original, and you could say it's very personally original. You see it and you say, that's Gaudi. You know, it's Gaudi's church. And you can say that's negative or positive. The question I have is, can that church continue? Can the architecture of Sagrada Familia, can they have children and continue? Or is it a one-off? Is it a brilliant masterpiece that gets finished now and dedicated, and it's it's kind of a one act, and you can't continue with that because it will look either like a copy or look silly.
Actually, just one point on that for a moment, is that I was stunned actually when I was there, maybe 5 years ago, and as you know, they're continuing to work on the building, and I thought, did Calatrava get the commission to do a piece of this? Because, I mean, it is actually being replicated. I mean, Calatrava's forms are almost just dead on these forms. Well, of course, they're made of steel and concrete in this case, but they're steel mostly. But anyway, you're right. It is extraordinary melody, and I agree with you. It's a very personal piece that will be difficult to repeat. But
Does it not, for you, does it not deliver the message?
Well, I think that a term that's interesting that I learned from Bill Westphal when I was at UVA, he coined a term called pious skepticism. So if you think of piety and skepticism, what is piety? It means you respect that which comes before you. If you're a pious, you never do anything new. If you're a skeptical, you never do anything old. If you're skeptical pious, you fundamentally don't trust the past, but maybe they had something good. And if you're a pious skeptic, you trust the inheritance of the past, but you say, I'm not going to copy that because this is our time and we have different knowledge. So the church is a pious skeptic institution, right? You have this gift of faith, and the church that comes before you is the mystical body of Christ, supported by the Holy Spirit. And so you say, oh, well, we've learned the theology of the body, say, since John Paul became Pope, which they didn't have in the 1500s. Well, that's a skepticism about taking, the theology of the 15th century and saying, yeah, this is still great, but it's still pious. And so you have a hymn that everybody knows, and you add a new verse in the middle, but it's the same melody, and the verses on either side are still familiar. So I think Sagrada Familia falls into this category of pious skepticism. It doesn't have to be a copy to be revealing what it's supposed to reveal.
I can tell you, it's funny, in this room a year or two ago, we had Etsura Soto, who's now the main sculptor for Sagrada Familia, come and talk. And you should look, all of you probably do know him, but you should look him up, and we should bring him back, because he talked the most movingly about his own conversion through stone. It wasn't even his conversion through, in this case, reading a text or meeting a person, his engagement with this material, and that in the end it was almost bigger than he was. He ended up learning from the stone as opposed to vice versa. And an incredible engagement with reality. So that's the man right now, to this day, guiding the stonework on the development of this still building cathedral.
Right, and the biblical
say that the child is a lot of what you're to say what these was. I have the same feeling that the hand, the mind touched that material and made it. We think we're going to go back to the handmade cathedral that cost 5 times more. And that's economic slavery in modern industrial world. Can't be solved.
Not always. It's not always more. The amount of money we're spending on these buildings is very high, and it depends where we want to invest. Where do we invest today?
It cost you 5 times. It's just not that kind of labor anymore. We're going way beyond that.
Who's going way beyond that?
Well,
Yes, we have,
but I
unfortunately.
can't disagree. But yeah, I had.
Not only that, but the lifetime of the building. When you have a glass building, you like permit admitted, you're going to have to replace it. They may want to replace it. But these buildings that we had 20 years ago, built 20, 30 years ago, glass and steel, we're spending tremendous amounts of money. This is the historic preservation of that. We're spending the cost of the building 2 or 3 times over to rebuild it again because it's such a massive.
Could I just weigh in on that for a second on that point? Is that, yeah, you're right, good point.
Hold on, excuse me, sir. I do want to let, I think this is probably a technical point.
Riled up
Yeah,
here,
it's okay.
So this is, first of all, I want to say one thing about the cost of Christ-like Cathedral, which is a lot of money. A lot of money was spent on this project, but you should know that this is not, and that's also what separates it perhaps a bit from the one in Los Angeles, which was the one in LA was about double or maybe triple the price of the one in Oakland, but that beside the point. The majority of the money of the project in Oakland did not go into Cathedral at all. It went into all the other dependencies, which consists of diocesan offices, consists of the parish hall and mausoleum, consists of conference centers, consists of clinics, legal clinics. They have a free legal clinic for the indigent. They're now developing a free mental health clinic for the indigent. I mean, this is not just about the cathedral, and that's the most evident thing, of course, but it's about an entire social program for this city. And it was part of a calculated real estate idea, too, which was to divest themselves of other properties and relocate in one place and be efficient. So that's where most of the money went into this project. So let me be just very clear about that. Regarding the effectiveness of certain materials over time, glass is one of the most long-lasting materials that you can have. Brick, you have to, if you're going to keep brick together, a brick building together, you have to re-tuck point it. I mean, this is not, every single building, every single work of architecture requires the love of human beings to keep it going. And I can tell you, the least sustainable building, the one that's going to fall apart, is not the one that's built with brick or glass. It's the one that is unloved. So you have to, as an architect, you have to be trying to make a building as worthy of being there for 300 years.
I would defend the LA Cathedral or the Oakland Cathedral for the cost. I don't think that Catholics should be against spending a lot of money on a temple to the Lord. We spend 2 or 3 times as much on baseball stadiums or even football stadiums, which get used. Football stadiums, not baseball stadiums, because they're really get used a lot, and there really are cathedrals. But football stadiums, again, I said that for Ed Keegan. But no, I would defend that, and that shows we put our money where our mouth is, and we do the other things too. We have the soup kitchen, the homeless shelter. We do all of it. It's not either or. So I would definitely defend spending large sums of money for the glory of God and the service of His people.
Before further questions, I want to take them all. We've got time to take them all. But we happen to be at a moment where we have in the room some architects who've done a lot of completed traditional church buildings. So I'd kind of like to get on the table whether these things are really more expensive or not. And I mean, you happy to throw around any dollar per square foot figures or whatever, because it's out there, and I'd like to know, are they or are they not kind of, where do they fall in the, because we have in the room probably more than usually you ever get of people who've done them.
Can I tell you an anecdote from my own university?
Sure.
We have a big campus built in the 1920s, mostly colonial, and they wanted to put an addition to the library, and the Chicago architect said, you can't afford to do this in limestone and brick. They had a $6.5, $7 million budget. So they developed a 24,000 square foot single-story building made of trusses that were hooked inside, wrapped together with cables. It had a 24,000 square foot roof, 24,000 square foot foundation, and lots of HVAC, and it was going to be a giant roof, basically at eye level. It was partly buried in the ground because nobody wanted to look at it because they thought it was an eyesore. So there was an architect in the room, James McCreary, and Frank Wilson McCreary at the time, said, we can do that. And they built a building for the same budget that is brick, limestone, trim, cork floors, wood, bronze, well, brass at least, and it was the same dollar amount. They saved money by shrinking the floor plan a little bit and reducing the needs for HVAC and finding creative ways to take the money that would have gone into a big roof and put it into limestone and handcraft. And that was one of the great success stories, I think, of how they can be one-to-one if it's done properly.
I want to stay on this. Do you care? I don't want to force you, but do you care to comment on more specifically on the cost of these buildings and how it relates to other ways to do it?
Specific buildings. Well, I mean, I think anybody who knows the cost of buildings would say that good buildings cost a reasonable amount of money, and great buildings cost a lot of money. And that doesn't matter the style; it's irrelevant. And again, that's I don't think that's a problem. I have never had to have this issue, do it this way or that way. But we've done buildings anywhere from, new buildings anywhere from $250 a square foot, $2,000 a square foot. And, it has to do with the materials and the longevity and the size. Obviously, a bigger building, you can cut down on the square foot costs. We haven't done big buildings like this. Yeah.
What was the square footage of
The cost per square foot, cost per square foot for Oakland was $448 a square foot. But you know, that's impossible. It's an impossible metric to apply. I don't think you can compare a church to an office building, which is, and even, I mean, I just finished a research building at Harvard University. It cost $450 a square foot. Built the same level of quality building, just finished almost a year later in Houston, Texas, for Rice University. It cost $100 a square foot less. So you know, it's very hard to compare these things across the board. And I would just say, I'm not here to defend the cost of Oakland, because it was, I mean, it's a very expensive project overall, definitely. No, $112 million for everything. And that's a lot of money, but also you have to understand that's also a lot of things that were bought as part of this, a 250,000 square foot project. But the way this building was built was probably the most, I'm talking about the cathedral, probably the most economical way you could build a structure of that size. And I can explain how that worked afterwards if you want to talk about it.
You know, the other thing that I think of, Craig, when you say that is, I think we should think of churches as cost per a cubed foot. We should think about volume, because that's really the ultimate thing. I know that in the early 20th century that people would actually design buildings like that. It was actually per cubic foot. Because, you know, you want a low ceiling basketball arena, yeah, we can cut the cost a bit. And but a great church needs to have verticality and transcendence, and that costs money.
You know, it's a fun exercise is go to one of these searchable Bibles online and put in the word column, put in the word gem, put in the word ornament, and you find that there's a pattern that the Israelites, when they're in right relation with God, they have on their fine robes, their gold earrings, and when they leave the true God after they go to the golden calf, he says, take off your ornaments, take off your earrings. They get them from the Egyptians. And so there's this notion that to be radiant and glorious with ornament and enrichment is a symbol of to be in right relationship with God. And that is something we still do. You dress for your wedding in a certain way that you don't dress every day. Festivity and importance have markers that are conventional in our culture. And so to just say, well, that's the inheritance of a past age, is to give away a very compelling marker of what a church is supposed to be.
I didn't get to James earlier. Oh, I did. No, wait a second. I did. You sit down. Oh, James, hold on a second. Let me follow up with somebody. Ed, pardon. Ed?
My question is really, when you look at the history of architecture, it's kind of amazing to realize that from the time of Constantine, if you look at architecture, from the time of Constantine to only about a century before the Reformation, that if you took out the buildings that were built as churches, the history of architecture disappears. And so the patrimony of the Catholic Church is for a good part of architectural history, our history.
San Chapelle is a sacramental building that uses engineering to achieve its
Right.
sacramental reality.
Which is secular, a secular text.
It's not engineering first.
In those terms. But the question I want to put to you that I think goes along with this is in the same last 150 years is when we really get more and more into the full individual architect. And because of industrial techniques, the idea of building a cathedral in 6 years is just a mind-boggling, out-of-body experience for most of American history. Gaudi knew when he started as a young man that even though he spent the rest of his life working on it, that he was not going to see it completed. And he was okay with that, because that was the way that architects worked and how they understood a project of that significance. How do we get to a point where, where we're comfortable, it's like, clearly, Duncan, you showed some amazing images of just incredibly mediocre things in the capital.
Incredibly mediocre.
In 2 years, I mean, mediocre is actually polite. But, I mean, these are the things we're asked to pick out now as architects, and yet, how can we get to the point where we can say, not only do we have to invest the money, but we have to invest the time, and that time may mean that the building may not be completed until your children's or even your grandchildren's generation, and if you build a solid foundation for for a structure that you have an initial design for, and then when you put that foundation, you put floor over it, that basement is actually going to be for a generation where mass is celebrated, and that basement will be good enough. It certainly won't be what we want to build in the end, but it is a parish that actually built it almost the same way we built Christian communities, went from having mass new homes to then suddenly appropriating facilities for their liturgy. So I wonder if each, I mean, I'd actually like to hear, each there's at least 6 different people.
Get 5 architects together, you get 20 viewpoints. Gentlemen?
How do we deal with, rethink this idea of, how do we rethink this idea of not only spending the money or doing something that's worthy, but being willing to live with it, live with construction over a long time, right? Build incrementally. Yeah, I have all these clients that talk that way. They say, oh yeah, we know the cathedrals were built over 100 years, so we can think that way. But what they really want is to build the building, have it look pretty nice on the outside, the inside finished, and then, maybe we'll put in some statues later. No, sorry, that's not the big money savings. So I don't know. I think this is so antithetical to our culture to wait and to 6 years or 4 years or whatever to do something that big. It's incredible, and even the things I've worked on that have taken 7 or 10 years. I mean, it's unthinkable in 200 years ago. I guess that's one of the benefits of modern technology. It allows us to build fast and sometimes cheap.
I want to just insert a comment. In our fundraising workshop, I can't remember everything that was said, but there was a fascinating little thing about time. I've heard a lot about time in this symposium, and I hope to be able to capture that as we do our proceedings document, because they said even the fact that pastors are rotated through parishes so quickly, and I don't know what the history of this is, if it's more frequently now than it used to.
Too. Yeah, it's a big
is
problem.
that every pastor has a certain very fixed amount of time in which to begin to undertake sometimes vast things, and if it isn't completed, then the next person comes along, starts a new project. So I don't know the answer to those, but I just had to throw that in as one of the interesting things. Anyway, go ahead, gentlemen.
Well, longevity of a pastor is like tenure in a university. You can use it well, or you can use it to goof off. And this does happen. And there's a parish that I worked with that had a design. The diocese took their money to build a school. They had another design, another fundraising campaign. The diocese took the money again to build, and they had a second design. And they had a third design by a pastor in the 80s that nobody liked by the time they got around to doing fundraising again, and they have a fourth design that they've just finished.
Wow.
And that's the longest non-building timeline I've ever heard of. Part of it is because the pastors were changing.
So that's a very difficult question. I would only say that, as you know, delayed gratification is not part of American culture at this point in time, or world culture, to be honest with you. And I think the idea of building a cathedral, I'll use a cathedral as an example, or chapel, whatever, but a cathedral especially, which is a big investment money, is an act of faith and on many, many levels. And, you know, and perhaps there was a stronger faith, you know, 6 centuries ago when the Duomo in Florence could be started without even knowing technically how you could even build a dome at that point in time. And they went ahead and built it. And then they said, we'll figure it out someday. And they, you know, 50, 60 years later they did. But today, you know, there's, and I'll just use the Oakland Cathedral for a moment as an example. That particular building, actually, since their original cathedral, St. Francis de Sales, had to be torn down after the earthquake, they needed they needed a symbolic home for the diocese. And I think this also comes back to the question of spending money. The architectural critic, Alan Timko, who was part of the selection process for that Oakland Cathedral, said that there was a lot of debate about spending this money. Should be spent for school instead. And his comment was, as others, that, you know, this is a building for everyone. It's for the poor as well as for the very wealthy. And if it does its job properly, it should be a place that will enrich the lives of everyone, the indigent as well as the most wealthy. So anyway, so it was, I think, and as was cited on other projects, these buildings and that one especially, there are things that there's another outside chapel that's to be built later on. There's lots of other things to be built over time, but to have some kind of a seat for the church in this place, and to have a place that symbolically was a place for their home was really important.
Steve?
Thank you for your presentation. Of course, we agree entirely about theological architecture, about the point of theological architecture. My concern is your preference of the temple, and particularly the Jewish temple, the precedent in the desert tabernacle, and then the instantiation in stone of the temple of Solomon, the second temple, and so forth. Because the Christian tradition really is about the body of Christ, beginning with God creating the body, the humanity. The temple is because of alienation. Because we're no longer in the garden, we're alienated from God, we're alienated from each other. We're still seeking that restoration. And we find in the model of the body of Christ, which Paul talks about, and because Jesus aligns himself to the temple, he says, my body is the temple. Then we find St. Paul talking about we are tents, clear allusion to the desert tabernacle, that is now the body that is redeemed. And then you find that wonderful passage in Revelation 21, where you have the heavenly Jerusalem coming down in city form, which of course is relating back to the Temple of Solomon, which is sitting in the city of David and so forth, becoming a nuptial image, again, of the body of Christ, the Lamb. All these things are conflating in a very harmonic, symphonic expression of the body, the temple, the city. So my concern is that if you're preferencing the temple form, you're taking one model of how we understand the ecclesia, rather than this fuller expression, which would also look at things like the Holy Mountain. I mean, there's, you know, the point is that Scripture gives us a language of metaphor and analogy by which we understand our relationship with God. So I'm calling into question your project of preferencing the temple, as at least you seem to be doing.
Well, I talked about the shadow, the image, and the reality, right? It was a 3-part talk, right? So the shadow, temple, is the shadow. Shadow's inadequate by definition. You don't use it as your primary model. That's why you have to talk about the fulfillment in the heavenly Jerusalem. And then since we're not there yet, you have to talk, how do you participate in it now? That's the image, right? So the church building is the image of the mystical body, and I believe I said several times, it's an image of the ecclesia, restored, the cosmos, heaven, earth, God, bride, bridegroom. That's what a church is. So I'm not trying to reduce it to the temple. Certainly, the temple is a foretaste, a shadow that needs to be fulfilled, and it's the fulfillment that we're hoping for. And it's the church building that allows us to participate in it. The temple's on the sacred mountain. And if you study the way the temple worked, the Romans, Herod was really clever. You would come in down low and you'd actually go underground and go up this staircase in the dark, and then you would come up out of it, and the south sun would be reflecting off the Jerusalem limestone, which was bright white, and blind you. So you had this experience of going from earth into the darkness, and then rise out into light. Not that every church has to be like that, but what does that tell us? Architecture can be a bearer of theological realities, raised to glory. Not just analogs, right? Not just it's kind of like that, but a bearer of that very reality that you get to experience, that is formed by you. That's what a sacrament is. That's a dual reality, an invisible reality that is made active and real and present. That's why the Eucharist is called the real presence. So I don't want to diminish the body, the mountain, all the other typologies. The altar was understood as Christ in many ways, because Christ's body was the place of sacrifice. He was the priest, so he was the offerer, he was the victim, he was all those things. All the many streams come together. The Word, if you read the Old Testament, they say, oh, what do I need bullocks and fat rams for, God's language? And then the other one says, well, do all this elaborate ritual of sacrificing animals. How do you reconcile those two things? Pope Benedict said, the true worship is a sacrifice of praise. Words are given to the Father, offering Christ again. So I don't want to get stuck in the shadow. It's all there. And I push the temple side because it's something people don't talk about very often. Is what I'm trying to say. Architecture has a sacramental role. Does that answer your concern?
We have a lot of, we both have a great appreciation for that. It seems to me the temple, per se, like the Mormons do a lot of work with sacred architecture related to the temple. Right? The Masons do a lot of work with sacred architecture related to the temple. Of course, that's all derivative because that's revealing a truth that we know through revelation.
And the temple helps us understand what are the prototypes for churches. Not to go back to the temple. God's presence in the Holy of Holies was limited, and it was very narrowly perceived, right? The whole idea was that eventually that presence would go out into the world and change the world into the temple of God, which is what our eschatological end is. The church now allows us to have a foretaste of that. So I would never want to reduce a church to a temple. God is not limited to a little building. God is in us. We're the living stones of the temple, and we take that up to the world. But nonetheless, the job of a building is to reveal to our eyes what a restored heaven and earth would look like. Just like the Eucharist its job is to bring to us and make real what divine life really is for us and how it changes us. It has an ascetic quality. And I don't mean ascetic like hair shirts and flagellating yourself. I mean ascetic like disciplining you and changing you into what you should be. So the temple's not obsolete, even though it needs to be fulfilled.
You know what I find interesting about the Temple of Solomon is how, and Dennis knows all this better than I do, but how many of the great thinkers and writers referred to it. And it's kind of shocking that Bishop Sujet, in his 2 essays on the building of Saint Denis, the first Gothic church, Gothic cathedral, talks about it. And he even says, well, and people have come from Jerusalem and they tell me that my church is even better than the Temple of Solomon. And so he's very aware that that's like a standard. Now, he's not maybe not dealing with it exactly the way Dennis talked about, but he deals with some of those same things, right? Light and heaven and so on, and certainly the jewels. He's definitely into jewels, like Dennis is.
And he quotes Book of Revelation and the description of the high priest's jewels explicitly.
But the other place that's really interesting too, and it's my favorite quote, is when supposedly when Justinian finishes that great Byzantine marble that relates also to some of what Dennis shows us, all those great Byzantine images, is Justinian walks into Hagia Sophia and says, "Solomon, I vanquished thee."
And he should, right? He's got hundreds of years later to figure out how to do it better.
I want to read, I'm trying to gauge how much some of the eyes doing this. We're running out of day, I think. But we've got a few people who had their hands up for a long time. I'll get to you. And I want to read this question that was turned in earlier. It's fairly long, so we'll try it here. But Dr. Nestor, speaking of the beauty of dissonance, also said, there's pain and suffering in the world. In the Middle Ages, the church was considered not just an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, but an imago mundi, image of the world. Medieval, let's see, I can't read it here, artists included a much broader range of imagery, including the pagan, fallen nature, and even violence, all of which was redeemed by the presence of Christ in a kind of dissonance resolved by the consonance of Christ. Where is this element in sacred architecture now? Is the church only the image of paradise, or does it include the human, that which needs salvation? So, if I can read this, what is the point of consonance or symmetry or perfection without dissonance, asymmetry, and imperfection?
Well, typically where those things are addressed is distinguishing between liturgical and devotional. The liturgy is meant to present to you a formative image of perfection. Now, we all know that we have all of our brokenness and our fallenness. And so you take a saint, St. Lucy, always shown with her eyes on a plate. You have pink eye, you go see her, and you say, please, St. Lucy, help me. Right? Liturgy is not help me. Liturgy is the mystical body speaking to the Father. It's the priest acting in persona Christi Capitis as the head of the body. So what's happening in heaven? If you understand these biblical typologies, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, spoke to God, and then came out with the blessings. What's Christ doing? Eternally pleading for us at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Well, we can't see that. How do you make it visible? The priest as the head takes the prayers of the body, brings them into the sanctuary, which is the new Holy of Holies, brings the grain offerings, the wine offerings right out of the temple, but now fulfilled and completed. They're transformed through the Holy Spirit, and then they come back out. Here is this very clear kind of image of paradise. Then you go to your chapel and say, I've got this problem. And when people sometimes get confused with architecture, there's a romantic mindset that runs through a lot of modernism too, which is an externalization of my emotional state rather than this objectively real thing that's going to form me so that my emotions, my intellect will be working together based on this external spiritual reality. So the devotional life is absolutely critical. And as soon as it fails, then people try to dump it on the liturgy. All the me and Jesus language of the liturgical music in the 70s is because we haven't found ways for that devotional outlet. You have to have them both. Absolutely.
I just got busy having a family. I'm coming at this from listening to all of the back and a little bit of sniping about different perspectives of beautiful modern architecture and old and history and thinking, has anybody ever in the history of trying to discern whether that's asking me on the street what they run out?
That may not be a good example to use.
Which one is a church for you? I mean, if you just go to, I have sat through conversations with people of my own age up to grandparents, especially from, the greatest generation of the World War II folks, who are angry at what they've seen unfold in church design in the last 30 years. Does anybody, do the bishops, do the pastors, do the architects consult the people in the pews about what they recognize as what makes them feel church, and what makes them feel elevated, and what it contributes to their own metanoia? I don't know. And I wonder, connected to that topic is, does the deciding of what is church and what is sacred and what is elevating us to beauty that pulls us out of our own people, is it left only to the domain of highly educated in this field? Or, and therefore, if it is, and it may continue to need to be, sometimes not coming valleys for eloquently lesson about how we depend on you, highly trained people, to do this for us. Well, if it's going to continue to be, then it begs the question, where is the theological formation? Is it being wedded with the young minds that are coming through at age 18, at 19 and 20? And how do we change that? And I stand here as an alum of Catholic University and say it did really happen very strongly in the 80s when I was here. And I look around at some of my alums, I'm beginning to get on Facebook, and I see some people who are stuck in some real misery. They're not yet on fire for the Lord, and they're not living lives that would make me, I can't see that the fruit of their architecture is also, reflecting that they're a graduate of the Pontifical University of Architecture.
Anyone?
How do we
Actually.
solve all that?
We got like
Big problem.
2 minutes.
It's a big problem. Now, would a brain surgeon ever learn to do brain surgery without knowing what a healthy brain is? What's the ontology of brain? Nerves go together, blood vessels in the right place. Then we train architects to build churches, and we don't tell them what a church is ontologically, except a skin for liturgical action. That's not a service to architects, and it's not a service to the people who hire them.
Did you go? Well, interestingly, Father Planty, I think this morning, or I can't remember when it was, has put this little compilation of church laws together. It's quite interesting. It's maybe still floating around here. But he said one of the things that's actually required that the church says we ought to be doing, I don't know how I feel about this, maybe it doesn't matter how I feel about it, is forming academies for sacred art and architecture. So it's, I don't know of any actual church-sponsored academies for sacred art and architecture, but it's an interesting thing that speaks a little bit to what you're talking about, unless this here is as a Pontifical University. You have had your hand up a long time.
And let me,
Wait a second.
if I could just say something like, I'm from your same generation. I mean, this is true across the country, and it's still true. I mean, look, this is that Enlightenment project of architecture is separate from, in fact, engineering, which is separate from psychology, which is separate from the liberal arts, which is definitely separate from theology. I mean, look, this is, and the people in this room of all different points of view, most of us have come to this on our own study, or having to grapple with it with clients, and you know, I've been happy to hang out with theologians and liturgists to learn a little bit. But I mean, this is a problem. 106 architecture schools in America, and it's, you know, it's been that way for a while.
Well,
Question about synthesis.
yes, but just one second. You need to actually. I
I'm
have to
sorry, I
let
have
Dennis
to,
go. He's
excuse
also has
myself.
another engagement this evening, but is very sad to have to leave us right now.
Well, the Foundation for Sacred Arts, and Mara's in the back, who runs it, has asked me to come give a lecture at St. Thomas at Becket Church in Reston tonight at 7:30. If you haven't had enough, or you know some friends in the area, feel free to come. We just tried to kill two birds with one stone and save money on plane tickets and everything. So I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here, and wish you all the best for the rest of the day.
We're not ending the panel, but thank you to you. Thank you very, very much. So, thank you for letting me do that. Yes, sir.
So, first of all, that was part of how the client in California has a lot of different styles. And, Mr. Harvey, by the way, I apologize for my own mistake. You mentioned, and other architects mentioned, dealing with large congregations of cathedrals that have very multicultural congregations. And my question is how do we sort of deal with that? Is the question, do we become more abstract, more sort of dealing with sort of boiling things down to abstract principles that are much more common or is it perhaps something of more sort of an adding of things, sort of like the Tex-Mex music, where it's a combination of Mexican and German? How do we do that today? Do we find these things, or perhaps it's both?
I'll just say one quick thing, let Duncan respond more thoughtful. But the first of all, I would suggest that there are certain basic issues with Christendom and with Catholicism that is universal, and somehow a cathedral or church needs to in some way possess that inherent DNA or quality. But then the point you make is that today we are unlike in the 6th century when everyone was from within a 50-mile radius. We have people now from all around the world. So it's a big issue, and I'm sure it's being grappled with in many urban churches. But this specific one in Oakland, the intent, the concept was to, in this thickened wall, we call it the reliquary wall, that has a series of chapels within it, that these, some of these are actually ones that can be given over specifically to either the Vietnamese or also in Hispanics or Chinese for certain culturally specific times, and that's the way it was dealt with there.
Yeah, and I too like that idea that within a cathedral certainly, but even within a parish church, that that there's a chance for elements that'll speak to different groups. I mean, we had the ethnic churches, which I think is still a good model. The German churches and the Polacks have the kind of Baroque something or other, and the Irish have their Gothic, and they had their saints and their names and so on. And that's a good model. I think it's still a good model that we are returning to in some parts of the country, especially with the Spanish and the Vietnamese. But in a church which has a mixed congregation, which a lot of them do, I like the idea that there are different things. There's that great story of, the priest that gets the new parish, and he comes in, and he, and because there's a growing Hispanic group, he decides to take out, in the first year, when you're not supposed to do anything except for your underwear, he takes out the statue of Our Lady of Lourdes and replaces it with Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the two ladies come to him after Mass, and he says, "So how do you like what I've done to the church?" "Well, it's very nice, Father, but what happened to Our Lady? We miss Our Lady." It's a joke. So the different ethnic groups that have a different, and there is that sense of, but of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe is for all the Americas. So, so I like the idea of the mixing of different elements that can speak to different congregations in one church.
Other people have had we'll take a few more. I see 3 hands up, and those will be the 3. So why don't you go ahead?
Okay. When one works in the classical language, which I see as the broad language from early Christianity up to today, okay, with multiple ways of doing things, plans, structural systems, iconography, I mean the whole 9 yards. In the West especially, it's a great variety, including the masterpieces and including the normal stuff. We can draw on all of that. And the great thing about the classical tradition is that it has been able to bring in other things and then make it part of the tradition. That's, obviously that's what I'm talking about with development. Whether it's borrowing things from other cultures or whether it's innovating things. And so I think that's, it's, if you understand the language, if you're fluent in the language, you can bring that in. The simple example of Thomas Jefferson bringing the so-called Chinese rail into the University of Virginia, and many other things. It can be brought in. The Romans bringing the obelisk to Rome. It's an Egyptian thing, right? And now we think of it as Rome. So the classical tradition has been very good at bringing in other things and making them part of the tradition and yet continuing the tradition. Interesting point that relates to the earlier question, I just realized it. Years ago, my students designed churches for a Hispanic congregation near Chicago. And there were a few Irish still left, but it was mainly Hispanic, and they were going to pay for it. And the students developed buildings that probably in this room you would say are different styles, okay? Something's more Romanesque, some were kind of Spanish, but many were not. Some were more Roman or more Italian or whatever. The Spanish people came in, and I asked all of them, getting back to your question, does it look like a church you would like? They like them all. I think there's a universality, whether it's a Spanish church, it doesn't just have to be in California, that can speak to people, even if I'm not of Spanish heritage or Polish or whatever.
Does the Modernist church, the 20th century church, say that Dominican Home Church, for example, does that stand in that vocabulary?
I think it's questionable.
I would say that if you showed that picture along with all of the churches, that's a church.
Some of the Bohm churches look like churches, yeah. They would, I agree with that.
The elder Bohm.
Yeah, I know Dominicus Bohm. I don't think most Americans would be drawn to that the way they would be. I mean, again, we're picking it out. He was a great architect, but I don't think most Americans would be moved by Dominicus Bohm the way they would to, Sagrada Familia or to, a Spanish mission or something like that. I don't think it has quite the universality, but it's a great architecture.
Okay, so I don't have much to add to it, except that, well, first of all, originality is a pretty slippery slope, as you know. I mean, I think originality can be combining things in new ways. I mean, we look at art is a very good example. Duchamp, obviously, that's original. Or you look at Richard Prince. Richard Prince takes, pictures of Marlboro Man advertisements, put it on the museum wall, and it comes worth, millions, $1 million bucks. I mean, that's another form of originality. And then there's the question of novelty, which is, I think, maybe perhaps a bad thing. We see a lot of that in architecture the architecture of the spectacular and so forth. So as far as as this relates to churches, again, I don't know if there's a single style, there's not a single form that necessarily represents what church is. And it's a difficult thing to grapple with. And it's like some people talk about art, beauty, when you see it. And I think that there are certain qualities about space that there should be a place apart. It should be a place that of respite that separates out the things we mentioned before about violence and so forth, which is part of our life. And this would be a place of respite that are solace and uplifting. I mean, you look at mission-style churches, you look at Gothic churches, you look at one in Oakland or whatever. I mean, I think they all convey this idea in different ways. But in the end, I think it's really important that, it's part of our human makeup, and you could say this is God-given, that we aspire to do new, better things. We don't aspire to simply be the common. We aspire to do good things, and I think that's part of what the Catholic faith is about. And if you take that further, I think that would suggest that the architecture of these buildings that represent this faith should continue to evolve also, not in superficial, formally driven ways, but in ways that are authentic to our place and time, our culture, and while adhering to some of these fundamentals we've been talking about. So anyway, I would only suggest that the idea of church isn't based upon a formula. It's based upon the best that we can do in our moment in time, and inspiring to make places that are worthy of being called a cathedral or a chapel. Yeah, it was, yeah.
But when you got the degree, what was your process? Did you go back to look at historical precedents, or did you look for form and symbols, things that were more how did you go about that?
Well, this is a long. I'll try to boil this down. We can talk about it later. But
And save
but
your 30 seconds.
But I would say that I really looked at this first of all from the point. First of all, the first question is, what's the liturgy that is the important issues today that needs to be part of this? That was absolutely fundamentally part of it. Second one was, what's this site about? What is it unique about this place that can be elevated in some way? Another question was, again, about the history of the church. There were a number of very profound questions asked by the diocese as part of the selection process, beginning with, look at your design work individually, and then it was a list of people to put together. So we submitted that. Then we were asked to write responses to questions that Dennis or Duncan would have been great at. For me, it was a struggle. It took me about...
Dennis.
I said Dennis.
He would have been good at it.
Anyway, it took me about 2 weeks over Christmas vacation to write this. There are questions like, how would you make a building, a cathedral that's both sacred and civic? How would you make a place that's both soaring and intimate? I mean, how would you make a place that is, art and all these kinds of issues? So, but it was a good way to get, for me at least, to get my head into these questions. And then there was interviews, and then finally down to 3 people design competition. So, so there was that part of the process. But for me, it was a question of the things I mentioned about what is about this particular site, what is about the liturgy, what is about our place and time in terms of technology. And there were intuitive questions for me also about simply what is sacred space. And for me, light was really what informed that. And I did a lot of other research. And I think Stephen Schlater maybe left, but he was, I actually asked, I found out about him at the theological, at the School of Theology, and we talked a lot about these issues. And my mentor I mentioned, Walter Netsch, who designed the Air Force Academy, I asked him about what he was still living at that time, and I asked him what he was reading at that moment. He mentioned the book by Rudolf Schwartz called The Church Incarnate, and this was written in 1938, depths of the darkness of Germany, translated in English in the early 50s, and advocated the idea of the ring, which later, of course, became really Vatican II, part of what Vatican II was about as well as talk about light. So all these things were part of that, and I can tell you more about it later. But so it's both intuitive as well as a kind of a process, a pragmatic one.
You know what I think we should do, because I think we're about worn out. I'd love to ask if either of you have anything you'd like to say that you haven't said yet, or any short sentence to wrap up, and then I'll wrap up with an equally short sentence, and we'll go to the reception. So anything you'd like to say, Duncan, to kind of
Well, I
finish up?
just want to say thank you to all of you all. Many of you presented wonderful papers, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear all of them, but I really appreciate you coming, and I appreciate the papers I heard, and the reasoned debate that happened a little bit after the papers, and this discussion, which was Michael Patrick's idea, and of course I want to thank Michael Patrick and George Martin and Eric Anderson for a great job, and we're very privileged to have all of you here, and especially Craig Hartman, that would come out to talk to us about this important church cathedral.
Yes, thank you. And if you're in San Francisco, stop by.
Wait, I want to thank Nina sitting right there in the blue, and Lindsay and Anna are the people who checked you in, who made a lot of this happen, so can we give them a big round of applause? And also Bob Willis in the back for the audio visual. I don't think I have anything to say you haven't already heard, so the reception really doesn't start until about 6:30, but last time they were already set up and ready to go, so they're probably ready to go. Head on down to Miller Room. Thank you.